Hello everyone. Use one of the many shaders they have available for free on there. We will use this simple 2D transition shader that was created by GraceMeet. I will put a link to it in the description. Now let's begin creating our shader. In the inspector, we go to the materials, and in the drop-down, we select a new shader material. We then click on the shader and create a new shader. In the material, under shader parameters, we see that 3 fields have been created: fill, color, and height map. I have created height maps using Krita and stored them in an art folder. Let's bring them into the project. With the root folder selected, Let's add the storyboards. To do this, with the story transition node selected, we add a new Sprite 2D node. Let's rename it to Storyboard. else statement to set the can play anim equal to true if the current sprite index is within the bounds. While we're at it, let's only play the click sound if we can play the anim.